Hi, everybody. My name is Don Coyhis. I am a member of the Mohican Nation. Our tribe currently resides in Wisconsin, and our tribe is a clan system. So I was born for the Turtle Clan on my mother's side, and my Indian name is Tantanka Wambly. That name was given to me by the elders when I was given the responsibility to be the keeper of this hoop of 100 eagle feathers. It was a ceremonial hoop that was in the prophecies for around 400 years. So I would just like to say I'm just really honored here to be at this gathering. I think that the title, I like the title, the Law and Mental Health Conference. I think it's just very, very appropriate for coming out of the COVID times and all of that this would really be a real fitting talk for us to give. So I'm about to give a 30-minute talk from a 30-year Wellbriety movement. So really, we're always excited to share what has developed for us in terms of our recovery process in Native American communities. What we say is that we're going to give you an eagle's view of the Wellbriety movement, and this will be, a lot of people don't know, but there are 572 different tribes in the United States. Each one has its own culture, they have their own language, they have their own traditions, and so the way that we present this is a way for the communities to take this process of healing and then adapt it to their own culture and to their own language and their own elders. And so we're going to just kind of give you an eagle's view of the Wellbriety movement. What has happened is, I'm getting my clicker to work here. Oh yeah. So what we'd like to start out with is to kind of let people know, even though there's 572 tribes, why they're all different. Well, the way that it worked out is each of the communities, the source for their culture, depending upon where they lived. So the natives who live up in the Pacific Northwest, they got their culture, their language, their ceremonies, their songs from the salmon, from the fish, from the mountains, from the sea, from the water. And so as time evolved, this is how they learned to be who they are. But of course, on the desert side, the people that live in the desert taught them. They taught them the plants, the cactus, the animals, and all of that. So their culture would be different than the woodlands, maybe on the East Coast. Then that culture was taught there by how they lived on the earth. And that's why we have 572 tribes, but they're all different because their teacher, our Mother Earth, taught them differently depending upon, you see, where they were living. So this is the way the communities in those days looked at. At the very root of the communities, they had their ceremonies, the elders' teachings, the culture, the language, the healing. So those small trees, they represent the children trees. So the little boy trees, we knew exactly how to raise little boys into men. And not only was that, but we also knew how to raise the little girls to become the women. And they were taught all these things from the root level of the culture. And of course, it wasn't done there. So then what happened is the women then had to go in the cycle of life and learn how to become elders. In the same way with the men, they learned other things that they needed to learn in the cycle of life. And then what happened is they developed into elders, and then the elders became very significant to the culture. So next to God, the elders knew, and we went to them we would say, Grandpa, how do I do this? Grandma, how do I do this? And so the elders were very important in our life. And this is the way that it was in those days. We had a system in place that the young people learned what the old people taught them in the cycle of life, as it developed generation to generation, they maintained a way of life that was very, very pleasing, very, very pleasant. And so this is the way it was in the original days. But then something happened to us. There's something that happened to us, happened to all 572 of the tribes. And this thing that happened to us, it took us from this way of life, and today this is the way that our many of our communities look. We have a lot of problems now. We have not just alcohol, but there's problems with heroin, with meth, with the missing and murdered women, mental health, the suicides, the present drugs. And so one of the things that we have to take a look at is that this is the current situation of what we are dealing with now in many of our Native communities. And so what this means then is this, is how did this happen is years ago, the government, as early as 1879, they had an Indian problem, and what they decided would work would be to assimilate the Native American into the dominant culture. So they created a system of 500 schools, and then in these schools, what they did was they went to the communities, and in the communities, they started taking the children out of the communities, thousands of them. They took them away from the parents. If you could imagine some Saturday that the military came and they took your children, you see, away from you, or that the government said you got to give up your kids. And so they put these kids into school systems, and their purpose was to re-educate them to fit into the dominant culture and not be a part of the Native culture anymore. So as they brought them to these schools, thousands of the kids, then what they started to happen was, instead of the kids learning what we would be teaching them, what happened was they didn't get the teachings. And so what happened over a period of time in these schools was the teachings that we would be giving them and the healing that they would be getting is they started not to teach them. They were teaching them other things that they were supposed to learn. And so instead of having the teachings that had been handed down in our communities, the spirituality, the ceremonies, they weren't allowed to see any of these. No culture, no language, no elders' teachings. And if they did talk in that way, what happened in those schools, the kids, there were a lot of beatings that took place with the kids. There was a lot of no speaking the language was taken away, English only, no cultural teachings. There was sexual abuse went on to many of the children that were there. And soap in the mouth, for example, when they spoke their language, to have them only speak the English language. And so what happened was none of the ceremonies took place, but when these little kids grew up and they came back to the communities, then they didn't know the culture. And so when they came back, this was the first time we started to see alcohol in our communities. This was the first time in our communities that we started to see a violence in the communities. It was the first time we started to see adult hurting children, because they had a tendency to start to treat their children like how they were treated in the boarding schools. And this was also where we first started to see such thing as sexual abuse started to take place in our communities. What this phenomenon was called, the boarding schools, the mission schools, the residential schools, it took place both in here and in Canada, and actually in many of the Australia, New Zealand, other places that this whole phenomena went on. And so I think today what we would call what these children experienced was early childhood trauma, things that happened to them that shouldn't have been happening to them as little children. And so what this phenomena is called is a historical trauma, or some would call it intergenerational trauma. And what it is, it's a combination of immense loss, traumatic events that are perpetrated upon an entire culture. So in our Native communities, over a period of time, from 1879, it was still going on even in 1960s, was to take away the culture, take away the language, to take away the land, the people, to take away the way of life, to take away the religion, the spirituality, and to destroy the family structure. And so what we found out was then this started to be handed down from generation to generation. It's only been lately that we started to understand the effects of this, of the descendants of the boarding school. Even if you didn't go to the boarding school, it has an effect on you in this way. About 10 years ago, the science world started to discover that this trauma that these kids experience, anyone experiences, that the trauma is recorded in the DNA. And once it's in the DNA, when you make a baby, then that, what's in the DNA goes down to make that child. And so this trauma then is transferred down to the next generation. We didn't know this before, but we just found this out here in the last decade or so. So then what our communities look like, when you take a look at the community, is you have the intergenerational trauma that many of our people are carrying on inside of themselves. And then you have the current trauma that is going on in our communities called the intergenerational trauma. The thing of it is that this trauma, what happens is it stays hidden. The communities keep it a secret. They don't tell anything. This trauma remains hidden for up to 3 or 4 generations. And after the 3 or 4 generations, what happens is it starts to surface. All of a sudden, things start to, you go, where did this come from? What is going on with it? You start to see an increase in suicide. You start to see a lot of problems in relationships, a lot of problems with drug and alcohol taken. And so what we found out is this, is that maybe it's easy to see this, is that what the elders told us and what the latest research says is that alcohol is not the problem, that drugs is not the problem. What they are actually is a symptom. There's something else causing this to take place among the people. And so what we finally figured out is we had to go down to the root level of the community and look at the cause. And this is where the Welbriety movement works. We don't work us on the surface to take on those issues. What we found is that there's underlying causes to many of these issues. And so we didn't know this before. So a lot of the grants and things that were available, they just looked at the surface. They didn't go down looking at the deep trauma that people are carrying around, inside of themselves as we pass this on from generation to generation. So this is what we're saying, is it's very important to understand the connectedness between the trauma and the current social issues and the family healing. It's a new phenomena that we didn't know in terms of community healing. So the question then is this, is that though this has been going on for so long, can this be changed? Is it possible for us to heal our communities? And so this is what we're saying, is this is where the elders helped us in the early 90s to launch something called the Wellbriety Movement. Now, what is the Welbriety Movement? What is it? Well, the Welbriety is way, way more than just being sober. It's more than just not drinking. It's developing our wellness to develop into 4 directions: emotional, mental, physical, spiritual. Not only that, but it's come back to the teachings of the original people, the principal laws and values of our Mother Earth, back to the culture. What we call this process is walking the red road. It's a way of coming back to the culture. It isn't going back living in teepees or hogans. It's about going back to the type of thinking and the type of training our children the way that the old people did it. And they said to us, you must also create a healing forest. So when we went to the elders for help in the early 90s, they said, this is how we're going to help you. We're going to give you 4 laws to follow. If you do these 4 laws, it will start to change the community. Number 1 law is you need to understand changes from within. So what we started to learn is that change is not from the tops down. So we started to make change programs. We made programs for men. How do you change you? Women, how do you change you? Family, how do you change you? Always looking at how do we change from within. The second law, they said, in order for development to occur, it must be preceded by a vision. So we started to see that the communities needed to have a vision. Then the third law they gave us, they called it the Great Learning Law. Baby, youth, adult, and elder. You just don't work just with teenagers, you got to work with everybody. That's how a change is made. They call it the Great Learning Law. And then they said you must create a healing force that we'll talk about here just in a second. And so based on the elders' guidance in these teachings, White Bison started to develop cultural-based programs since 1988. So over the last 34 years, we continue to develop cultural specific programs. And as we did that, we started to see a lot of success going on in the communities. And so what we're saying is this, is that there's a website that you can look at. It's called whitebison.org. And of course, we developed all kind of training projects that we are now calling the Wellbriety store, that you can go and check it out to see that there's books and literature that we've written over these 34 years. And so this was how the elders helped us to see what we're supposed to do. They said instead of focusing on the historical trauma, they said what you need to focus on is creating what they called intergenerational healing. And what is that? That is a combination of immense healing community training and return to the ceremony, spirituality, the culture, and bring it back by reintroducing the culture, introducing the language, introducing the ties to the land, the people's health, the way of life, to come back to the native religions, and to also rebuild the family structure. And so what they told us would happen as we did this, instead of passing down a trauma from generation to generation, what you would start to see is that we would break the cycle. That what would happen is, instead of passing on the trauma, what would happen is we start to see the transferring of trauma in the current generation, this generation, 2000, started in 2000s, early 2000s, now it's 2021. So we started to realize we had the ability to change the current generations, baby, youth, adult, and elder, and this is how we start to transform our communities. And so we were excited that we had some guidance that started to make sense. The elders gave us spiritual laws. They started to give us teachings. And we started to understand we needed to understand this relationship between the cause and what our current social issues are. And as we healed and changed the cause, then what we start to see is that symptoms started to change. And so over a period of time, we developed a number of cultural programs that it was, the theme of it is, how do you change you? So we made a program called Medicinal 12 Steps for Men. We took AA's 12 steps, we put them in a circle, we added the Indian knowledge to it, and then we started to show the men, this is how do you change you? And so we made a program very similar for women, because men and women are different. And then we also started to make programs like for fatherhood. How do you change you to become a father? We had programs for motherhood. Then we started to work on the children, sons of traditions, teaching the young boys, this is how do you change you? How do you look inside of yourself? And then we had Daughters of Traditions program, teaching them the culture, the songs, intergenerational healing, not just working with the adults, but having the elders help us teach the children on how they were taught, you see, in the old days, that they would learn their meaning and purpose to life. And so we continued to make programs, and what we did is we taught the community members, you are the ones who will bring these teachings to your own community. So the Welbrite Movement, the White Bison, we go and we train facilitators how to run groups and how do you change your own community yourself. The reason for that is the elders told us this. When we look at a community, they said, the community is the therapist. They said the community is the counselor. The community is the healer. The community is the culture. How was it in the old days when you had a problem, then you would go to grandma? Or grandma would say, you go see this medicine person. So we started to see that the community had just lacking the knowledge on how do you start this healing process. And so this is what we found out is the solution resides in each community. It isn't on Google, it's not outside. The solution is inside of the people in the community. And the community is interconnected. It takes everybody to heal that community. And healing will take place through the application of the culture and spiritual knowledge. In that healing is entirely possible. And when we started to get these teachings from the elders, it just started to make sense to us. So over a period of time, you could have sometimes as many as 7 trainings going on. You could have the boys have training, the women have training, people coming in recovery. So this is how our communities are starting to look now. Instead of having that sickness, you're starting to see powwows, and you're starting to see sober gatherings and various activities and culture and sweat lodges and sun dances. Things are starting to come back. So when you look at our community, it's no longer that sick community. This is what would be a picture of the healing community and what it looks like. So we started to see over a period of time, people started to change themselves. The elders started to teach us thinking is connected to action, is connected to results. And so what they taught us when we started to bring back the culture, then our thinking changed, our action changed, the results changed. And as that happened, then we started to see our people started to change themselves. They started changing their habits. They started to change not just their habits, but they started to change their character, and they started to see that we had a different destiny. And so we started to see our people started to change. The men started to change. The women started to change. And so what we started to see was this. We have something called a Wellbriety movement. And that was the idea of this Welbrite movement of teaching the culture, coming back to the principle, laws, and values. Over a period of time, the elders continued to give us teachings that we didn't have. We started with 4, and now we have many teachings that they gave us when we were ready. And so it started out very small. So on the other end of the teeter-totter, we started to create small groups at different places across Turtle Island or the United States. And as time went on, we started to create more groups. We started to train people. I think altogether since in the 34 years, we've trained over 20,000 people in the local communities who would put on their own training for their own people, adding their own culture, adding their own teachings, having their elders come and talk to them. So it wasn't about White Bison's teachings. Our teachings was to present a type of transferring information that they could add their own culture. They could, up in the Pacific Northwest, the Welbrite Movement is about this, is about the salmon and the land and the songs and the singing. It's about that. But if you go to the East Coast, they are healing too. There's a Welbrite movement going on there, and then so many of the communities. But each of the trainings is a little bit different. And so what happens is over a period of time, more people got the trainings. It was intergenerational teaching. So we continue to develop programs like for families, for motherhood. We went into the prison system. We want, when our men and women come home from prison, we don't want them going back. So we started to train even our Native people in prisons. And we had programs for veterans, for them coming home, you know, from the wars. And so over a period of these 34 years, we just continued to train more people not for us to go there, but for us to teach them, this is how you change your community. And so over a period of time, we call it the tipping point. So as people started, then this movement started to spread into Canada, into the United States, into most every tribe that I know of now has some form of Wellbriety movement going on into it. And at the tipping point says when enough people get into it, it tips the point, and that we now have a movement, a Wellbriety movement going on in our communities all across the United States. And it's not something that White Bison owns. It's not something, it has its own power. I guess it would be maybe similar to the civil rights movement. That movement took place, more people are involved in it, and it has a life of its own. So this Welbrite movement, it's about recovering. It's about coming back to the culture, coming back to the songs, teaching our children, you see, to have that way. So the movement is going on very, very strong. And so what does that mean for us? The movement it's not a word, it's a live entity. There are people talking to people, it's transferring information, it's sharing data. We have now Zoom meetings all over the world now. We have Wellbriety movements in Ireland, it's in Mexico. We're starting to translate teachings into other languages where there are native people you see in other countries. And so this movement, it's not dead, it's alive. It's not even something we can control. It's just something that what we try to do is just to be of service to it, not to control it. And so this movement is alive, and people are talking to each other, visiting each other. We have hundreds of groups. If you look on our website, you'll see that there's Wellbriety meetings all over the place. We have Native American Al-Anon groups going now. So there's it's just taken off. Something is very, very big, and it continues to expand. And so this is what we are saying about this is we are coming back to that old system, not to go back and live in teepees, as I said before, but we're starting to see bringing back our culture at the root level. And so the question is this, are there any other benefits of getting a Wellbriety movement going or getting to a recovery movement? So what I'm trying to explain here is that investing in recovery, investing in getting people sober, not just sober, but investing in teaching the culture, teaching the language, having our elders come back. What happens then when you get sober and you start doing what you're supposed to be doing? We start to get responsible. Our men are becoming responsible dads. So we have a responsibility that starts to take place, different than when we were drinking. You start to see in this investment, our culture comes back. Our culture is about a way of life. It's about all sorts of teachings and things like this. Our ceremonies return. There is a lot of things that are hidden in ceremonies that we need to know about healing, about how we're to conduct ourselves, how to live away our lives. We're not driving impaired anymore. It's not that way. There are just thousands and thousands of us are in recovery and are sober now as a result. And you'll hear people say, they're not always saying, my name's Don, I'm an alcoholic. They'll be saying, my name's so-and-so, I'm in recovery. My name's so-and-so, I have long-term recovery. My name's so-and-so, I'm in Wellbriety. So people are starting to do this. But this investment is intergenerational. I have 6 children. Those 6 children have produced for our family 20 grandbabies. None of my grandbabies drink anymore. They're all sober, all 20. They're in school. They're doing well. It's not that our family is like Ozzie and Harriet. We still have family issues, but we know how to solve them and take those things on, you see, in a healthy way. So it isn't just in this investment. When you invest in a culture of our communities, it's intergenerational. We know how to follow safety rules. We know about healthy foods and exercise. We have thousands of our people going to get different types of education to come back and to help our people continue this growth process. And we're teaching our children the culture. When they learn the culture, they're not going to be going through the alcoholism process like it was in the old days. And so sobriety, recovery, healing, this is a natural word for us. This isn't something we whisper to one another. This is something that we're very, very proud of. We're proud to be having our communities to be in recovery, to be in sobriety. And so I'm just so honored that I could just share, within this, what is going on in the Wellbriety movement. And the Welbrite Movement is not just a native thing. We always say that our teachings they cover 4 directions: red, yellow, black, and white. And so there's many other people that are benefiting and joining in this Wellbriety movement. And so I just want to thank you that we're able to share this 30 minutes with you. And we just wish everybody just have a real good day and enjoy this gathering. Thank you very much for allowing us to share. You have a good day. Bye-bye.